Viewer discretion advised. This story contains descriptions of real historical atrocities. The stones of Mauthausen still remember. They remember the weight of bodies that carried them, the echo of boots on granite, the rhythm of screams that never stopped. Mauthausen was built not for life, but for exhaustion, a place where a human being was reduced to a movement, a breath, a statistic. In 1938, when the Nazis annexed Austria, the SS chose a hill near the town of Linz to create what they called a Category 3 camp, the most severe classification in their system. The official term meant return not anticipated. It was, by design, a one-way passage. At its center lay the Wiener Graben quarry, a vast pit carved deep into the earth. From it rose a staircase of 186 uneven steps, cut from the same stone that prisoners were forced to carry. The men who survived called it the Stairway of Death. Every morning before dawn, sirens wailed across the camp. Barefoot men wrapped in striped rags marched down into the quarry. They were from everywhere: Poles, Spaniards, Soviets, French, Jews, teachers, doctors, farmers. No one cared about names. Each man had a number sewn onto his chest. Their task was simple: descend into the pit, lift a block of granite heavier than their own body, and climb back up those 186 steps. Then do it again and again until someone collapsed. The air in the quarry was always cold. The stone walls trapped the sound of metal, of coughing, of orders barked in German. Guards waited at the top of the stairs, their hands in leather gloves, their eyes scanning for weakness. When a prisoner stumbled, the guards shouted, laughed, and sometimes helped with a shove. Those who fell were left lying on the steps, their stones rolling back down, knocking others off balance. Death often began with one body falling, followed by 5, then 10, a cascade of granite and flesh. Spanish prisoner Francisco Boy, who later smuggled photographs out of the camp, remembered the sound. It was like thunder, a human thunder made of stones and screams. For the SS officers, it became entertainment. They called it the parachute. They would force prisoners to stand at the edge of the cliff, arms stretched like wings, and push them over one by one. The fall was 70 feet onto sharp rock. The men below were ordered to retrieve the bodies and carry them back up the stairs. If they refused, they joined them. The camp commandant, Franz Zierreis, often watched from the balcony of his villa overlooking the quarry. He would sip wine as the column of men climbed the hill under the weight of stone. He called it the perfect order of labor. Under his command, the quarry became both a workplace and a weapon. The SS measured efficiency not by the amount of stone delivered, but by the number of bodies removed from the barracks each night. By midday, the steps of Mauthausen glistened as if wet from rain. But it wasn't rain. The granite was polished by blood and sweat. Those who slipped were beaten until they stood again, or until they didn't move at all. Sometimes, the guards forced prisoners to race up the stairs with heavier and heavier loads, betting cigarettes on who would die first. Above the quarry, on the plateau, the camp spread like a fortress. Stone walls, barbed wire, watchtowers. Beyond them, the barracks, the crematorium, the showers that led to nowhere. Every inch of its design served a single purpose: to erase identity, to convert a man into labor, and labor into death. At night, silence covered the camp. The prisoners lay side by side on wooden planks, their bodies trembling from hunger and exhaustion. From the commander's house came music, laughter, gramophone tunes, the clinking of glasses. Below, the men whispered names of wives, mothers, cities. The names became fainter each day. One German engineer from the DST company, which managed the quarry, wrote in his report, "Labor output remains suboptimal due to excessive mortality rates." It was the bureaucratic language of genocide, death measured as inefficiency. Winter made the quarry even crueler. Snow covered the steps, hiding the sharp edges, making each climb a gamble between survival and the abyss. The guards joked that the white snow made it easier to see the red. Some prisoners froze mid-ascent, locked forever in the position of lifting a stone. When the war neared its end, Mauthausen was overflowing. Over 200,000 people had passed through its gates. Most never came out. By April 1945, starvation, disease, and shootings had consumed nearly everyone. Those who remained were too weak to stand. On May 5th, the gates were opened by American troops. What they found defied belief, a landscape of bones and silence. The quarry was empty, but the stones still bore marks of hands that once held them. The staircase was intact. Wet from rain, the officers who survived claimed they had only followed orders. Today, visitors who climb those same steps say they feel a strange heaviness, as if the air itself resists movement. Perhaps it is just imagination, or perhaps the stones do remember. Because Mauthausen was not merely a camp. It was a design, a human invention that proved one terrible truth. You can build hell from granite and it will stand longer than flesh. In Mauthausen, cruelty wasn't chaos. It was routine. Every morning began with the same sound, the siren's metallic wail slicing through the fog over the camp. 5 o'clock. Prisoners rushed out from the barracks into the courtyard, barely alive after a night spent shoulder to shoulder, breathing each other's breath. The frost bit through the thin striped uniforms, and many could no longer feel their fingers. They lined up in rows, silent, motionless. Above them, the watchtowers loomed like stone crosses. Inside the towers, SS guards smoked, rifles resting lazily on the railings. From the officers' quarters came the smell of coffee and soap, the scent of normal life in a place designed for death. This was the daily roll call. 10,000 men stood still for hours while the guards counted and recounted, barking at the slightest twitch. If one man collapsed, the entire row stayed frozen until he was dragged away. Those who fainted twice never returned. They were removed from labor. A bureaucratic phrase that meant only one thing: shot before lunch. The guards enjoyed these mornings. They called it discipline, but among themselves, they called it warming up. The camp commandant, Franz Zierreis, sometimes appeared on the balcony overlooking the courtyard. He was a tall man with narrow eyes and the posture of a military actor. To the SS, he was the father of the camp. To the prisoners, he was simply death with a clipboard. Zierreis believed in order, a perfect hierarchy of suffering. Each block had its own overseer, each group its own capo, usually chosen from criminals or collaborators who had learned to survive by imitating their masters. In Mauthausen, pain flowed downward like water. From commandant to guard, from guard to capo, from capo to prisoner. The guards did not just kill, they played. Sadism here was structured like a schedule. One of their favorite amusements was called the bridge. Prisoners were forced to stand on a narrow wooden plank, stretched across a muddy ditch. Two guards, laughing, would make them fight with shovels for entertainment. The loser, or both, would fall. Sometimes the plank was greased with soap to make the show last longer. Another game involved dogs. Massive German shepherds trained to tear flesh at a single command. The guards would release them into the yard, shouting, "Find the lazy ones." There was no way to win. If a man ran, he was shot. If he stood still, the dog attacked. The officers timed how long it took before the screaming stopped. Prisoner diaries describe evenings when officers, drunk on schnapps, would march through the barracks, picking victims for sport. They would ask simple questions in broken French or Polish. Who's the strongest? Who can sing? The winner of each question became the next victim. One survivor later wrote, "They didn't kill from anger. They killed from boredom." Music accompanied the horror. The camp orchestra, a group of prisoners forced to play, stood near the gate. Each morning, as men were led to the quarry, the first notes of cheerful marches echoed through the cold air. The irony was precise, deliberate. The SS officers called it the rhythm of work. At night, when the trucks returned loaded with corpses, the same musicians had to perform again. This time, waltzes. Violins over death. One of the musicians later testified, "If we played out of tune, they beat us with our instruments. But the worst was when they smiled and asked for encores." The orchestra played even during executions. The guards claimed it calmed the prisoners. In truth, it was part of the ritual, the illusion of civility over the machinery of extermination. Inside the camp's medical block, the games turned scientific. The so-called doctors of the SS conducted experiments in hypothermia, infection, and endurance. Prisoners were submerged in freezing water to measure how long it took for the human heart to stop. Others were injected with gasoline, phenol, or pathogens. None survived. Dr. Heribert Heim, later known as the Butcher of Mauthausen, performed operations without anesthesia, removing organs for study. He kept a notebook of his procedures, each entry written with the precision of a laboratory report. When the camp was liberated, his office contained jars of preserved organs labeled with prisoner numbers. To the guards, it was all just another layer of entertainment. They watched through the door, betting on whether the subject would scream or faint first. Life in Mauthausen followed a grotesque rhythm: work, roll call, death, music. The routine repeated until it became mechanical. Even the prisoners, broken beyond recognition, began to move in perfect synchronization, a choreography of survival. Food was a watery soup made of turnips and bones. Bread, if it appeared, was divided into 6 pieces. Men fought over crumbs, but never over pride. Pride had no place here. The barracks reeked of sweat, mold, and sickness. Lice crawled through every blanket. The air was thick with the smell of decay, not fresh death, but something older, deeper, almost chemical. At night, some prayed, others whispered stories from their old lives: cafes in Paris, farms in Poland, football matches in Madrid. Words were a form of rebellion. The SS could steal bodies, but memory was harder to burn. And yet, even memory began to fade. One Spanish prisoner wrote on a scrap of cement paper, "I used to remember my wife's face. Now I only remember her color." The women of Mauthausen played their part too. Female SS overseers from nearby subcamps often visited the main compound. Among them was Margaret Schenk, known to prisoners as the Angel of Stone. Her beauty was spoken of with terror. Witnesses said she ordered men to strip before execution and then smiled for photographs. Others, like Anna Schmidt, organized selections for medical tests, meaning the gas chamber. They laughed with the guards, posed for snapshots with skulls, and sent letters home describing the hard but important work. To understand Mauthausen, one must understand this: the horror was not the product of rage, but of normality. These men and women didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as employees doing a difficult job for their country. They clocked in, gave orders, killed, and went home to their families. The camp even had a Christmas party. Records show that on December 24, 1943, the SS officers held a dinner with wine, roast goose, and carols. Below in the barracks, prisoners received a single extra slice of bread. WWII gave a speech about discipline and faith. The next morning, 20 men were executed for stealing potatoes. By 1944, the rhythm of death accelerated. The war was turning against Germany, but in Mauthausen, the killing only grew more desperate. Trains arrived from across Europe, packed with new prisoners. The crematorium burned day and night. Its chimney became the only constant shape against the winter sky. The guards began what they called sportive shootings. Prisoners were ordered to run toward the fence. Anyone who touched the wire was electrocuted. Those who stopped halfway were shot. The SS photographed the bodies as escape attempts. In the official records, it looked like order. One witness remembered the smell of burning hair drifting across the yard. Another recalled the guards whistling opera tunes between executions. The juxtaposition was unbearable, yet perfectly Nazi. Murder, performed with etiquette. In the final months, starvation turned the camp into a landscape of living ghosts. Men weighed less than 40 kilograms. They moved slowly, like shadows detached from their bodies. The guards called them Muselmänner, Muslims, a grotesque term for those who had given up, whose eyes stared but saw nothing. Still, the games continued. In March 1945, a group of SS officers celebrated a comrade's promotion by forcing prisoners to fight each other barehanded for scraps of bread. They filmed it on a home camera. The reel was later found by the Americans. Another report described the cold cell, a small stone room where prisoners were locked naked for days with buckets of ice poured over them. The guards called it the refrigerator. Few lasted more than 24 hours. The cruelty had no strategic purpose. It was not for discipline or information. It was performance, an expression of power stripped of reason. And yet even here, traces of humanity flickered. A Czech doctor secretly treated the wounded using bits of cloth and dirty water. A Polish priest shared his bread. An Austrian prisoner risked his life to hide photographs, the same photos that would later expose the crimes of the camp. But for every act of mercy, there were 100 acts of madness. One evening, as the sun sank behind the quarry, the guards staged what they called a parade. They ordered the prisoners to march in a circle around the yard while the orchestra played. Then, without warning, they opened fire from the towers. The survivors were made to bury the dead and clean the blood from the stones. When asked after the war why they did it, one guard answered, "It was nothing personal. We just followed orders." By April 1945, the empire that built Mauthausen was collapsing. Allied planes roared overhead. The guards grew nervous, but not remorseful. They destroyed documents, burned lists, and shot anyone too sick to move. The crematorium ran out of coal. Bodies were stacked in piles behind the infirmary. Franz Zierreis tried to escape. He was caught days later, hiding in the woods. Wounded by gunfire, he was interrogated by American officers. On his deathbed, he confessed to everything: the executions, the parachutes, the medical experiments. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "The stones were cleaner than the people." When liberation came on May 5, 1945, the Americans found a world frozen in time. The gate still read, "Arbeit macht frei." The orchestra's instruments lay broken in the mud. The barracks were silent except for the whisper of wind through the barbed wire. Photographs taken that day show the quarry under gray skies, the steps still slick with rain. The soldiers who walked among the survivors described it as a factory where the product was death. One officer wrote in his journal, "We found no monsters here, only men who had forgotten they were human." Today, the quarry at Mauthausen is quiet. Tourists climb the same 186 steps, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone. At the top stands a memorial, a simple slab engraved with one sentence: "To the memory of those who died climbing these stairs." But the truth is heavier than any monument, because the evil of Mauthausen wasn't just in the killing. It was in the laughter that accompanied it, in the paperwork that justified it, in the games that made it feel ordinary. The camp taught one lesson history can't forget: that the greatest horror is not how easily humans can die, but how easily others can watch. They called it efficiency. The machine of Mauthausen was built on the logic of numbers. How many could work, how many could die, and how much could be extracted from each body before it stopped breathing. Everything had a place. The quarry, the barracks, the crematorium, the so-called infirmary. It was a factory line in which human life was the raw material. The hospital was not a place of healing. It was the final stop. Doctors in white coats took notes, measured pulses, asked for volunteers. Sometimes the men believed them. A medical check, they thought. Maybe a chance to rest. But the injections were lethal. The record books used the word Herzstillstand, cardiac arrest, written thousands of times in neat handwriting. Those who lasted longer became subjects. The SS physicians wanted data. How long it took to freeze to death. What happened when the lungs filled with poison. How a bullet wound closed without care. They recorded every second. Dr. Auribert Heim, the butcher of Mauthausen, stood over the operating table like a professor. He removed organs, injected chemicals directly into hearts, and dissected the corpses himself. He told his assistants he was searching for efficiency in pain. Sometimes he made prisoners watch. One of them later said, he wanted to see if the soul left the body. He said he never saw one. The crematorium burned day and night. Its brick chimney stained the sky black, visible even from the town below. The villagers said they smelled something chemical. Few asked questions. The smoke became part of the landscape, like the river or the hills. Inside, a team of prisoners worked in silence, the Sonderkommando. They hauled the bodies from the carts, stripped them of clothes and gold teeth, then pushed them into the furnace. The work was methodical, timed, efficient. Each load lasted 15 minutes. When the ashes cooled, they were shoveled into sacks marked construction material. Some were used to fill paths. In the camp office, SS accountants tallied production, cubic meters of granite extracted, kilograms of flesh incinerated, the ratio of calories to labor hours. Murder had been industrialized, given shape and procedure. Around Mauthausen stood a constellation of smaller camps. Gusen, Ebensee, Melk, Steyr. Each had its own specialty. Gusen was the harshest, a labyrinth of tunnels dug by hand, meant for underground weapons factories. Prisoners worked in darkness, their skin turning gray from dust. Many suffocated before they saw daylight again. Ebensee was called the Hell under the Mountain. The tunnels there were meant to protect the Reich's final secret projects. Rockets, engines, weapons that would never be finished. The men who built them died one after another, buried in the same rock they dug. The women's camps fed the system too. In 1944, hundreds were transferred from Ravensbrück to Mauthausen's satellites. They stitched uniforms, sorted ammunition, and cleaned the officers' quarters. Some were forced into the brothel, created by the SS as a reward for cooperative prisoners. The records called it Sonderbau, the special building. No one left it alive. Each layer of the camp was designed to erase thought. Orders replaced conscience. The guards followed routine so strictly that even murder became a matter of form. When a prisoner was hanged, the rope had to be new, the photograph precise, the report stamped. One mistake meant punishment, not for killing, but for inefficiency. At roll call, when the bodies of the dead were laid before the block, the capo counted them as if they were tools. Zane, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12. The guards wrote the numbers, lit cigarettes, and watched the smoke rise into the same sky that hung over Europe's cities and homes. There were days when the quarry was quiet. No shouting, no gunfire, just the steady scrape of metal on stone. Those were the days when the system worked perfectly, when death no longer needed noise. By the beginning of 1945, Mauthausen had become a world of shadows. Overcrowded, starved, riddled with disease. It held more than 80,000 people meant to vanish before the war ended. Trains kept arriving from Budapest, Prague, Krakow, wagons without food, water, or air. The guards called them Transporte aus dem Osten, transports from the east. When the crematorium could no longer keep up, pits were dug behind the quarry. Prisoners were shot in groups, the bodies covered with quicklime. The commandant reported, "Sanitation measures completed." Yet even as Germany collapsed, the killing continued. The ideology that built Mauthausen no longer needed a reason. It fed on momentum, on habit. The SS called it Durchhalten, holding out. Holding out meant continuing to murder until the last moment. In April, the Americans were approaching. The thunder of artillery echoed from the west. The guards grew restless. Some began destroying documents. Others emptied the warehouses of stolen possessions, watches, shoes, children's toys, and loaded them into trucks heading toward Linz. The prisoners knew the end was near. Rumors spread like sparks. The Americans are close. But even in the final days, hope was dangerous. When a group tried to rise up, the guards shot dozens, then hung their bodies at the camp gate as a warning. One of the last acts of the SS was the Death March. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march south through the mountains toward Gusen and Ebensee. Those who stumbled were shot where they fell. Their bodies lined the roads like milestones of despair. Inside the camp, the remaining men, too weak to move, waited in silence. Some prayed. Others stared at the sky, counting the planes that flew overhead. On May 5th, the first American tanks appeared at the gate. The guards had fled or surrendered. The prisoners didn't cheer. They simply watched, too hollow to react. The soldiers found piles of corpses, rooms filled with ashes, and faces that barely looked human. One officer wrote later, "It was as if we walked into another planet, a planet built entirely from stone and screams." When the trials began months later, many of the guards claimed ignorance. They said they had obeyed orders, that the system was too large to question. In the courtroom, they looked ordinary. Men who could have been teachers, mechanics, fathers. Some even cried. Franz Zierreis never stood trial. Shot while escaping, he died before he could face justice. His body was displayed at the camp gate. For many survivors, it was the first time they saw him silent. Dozens of SS officers from Mauthausen and its subcamps were later executed. But not all. Others disappeared into post-war Europe, changing names, starting families, living long lives among people who never knew. Today, Mauthausen stands in silence. The quarry is green again, grass growing between the stones. The Stairway of Death is clean, the steps no longer slick with blood. At the top, visitors stop to catch their breath and look down at the valley. They take photographs, some whisper. Most cannot find words. Every May, survivors return, fewer each year, to stand before the memorial. Their voices tremble, but their eyes stay clear. They speak not of revenge, but of memory. One of them, an old man from Spain, once said, "The stones do not hate, they only remember what men made them see." And that is the truth of Mauthausen. It was never just about cruelty. It was about the precision of cruelty. About how ordinary people, step by step, built a place where the line between duty and evil vanished completely. The camp was liberated, but the idea behind it, that humans can be reduced to numbers, never fully died. It lingers in reports, in orders, in systems that measure life by its usefulness. Mauthausen ended in 1945, but the stones still breathe, quietly, under the rain. And every echo on those steps is a question left unanswered. How far will obedience carry us before we, too, forget what it means to be human? At first glance, Mauthausen looks peaceful now. The granite walls stand under a clear Austrian sky, surrounded by green fields and quiet villages. Birds circle above the quarry, their wings tracing the same paths that once carried the black smoke of the crematorium. The tourists who come here speak softly, as if afraid to disturb something that still breathes beneath the surface. The gates are open. The sign Arbeit macht frei is gone, replaced by silence. Yet the stones remain, the same stones the prisoners once carried. They shine faintly in the sun, cold, smooth, eternal. It's easy to mistake this stillness for peace, but those who listen carefully say the air hums with memory. After the liberation in May 1945, the Americans called it a death factory. General Eisenhower ordered that everything inside be documented before it could be touched. The barracks, the instruments, the ashes, even the smell. The photographs taken, then, became some of the most haunting images of the war. Skeletal survivors standing before the stairs, eyes too tired for tears. The journalists who entered the camp that week wrote that they felt no triumph, only nausea. One of them noted, "It is impossible to believe men built this place. It feels like the work of something darker." The first task was to bury the dead. Over 10,000 bodies lay in pits around the camp, some half-burned, others decomposed in piles. Soldiers and survivors worked side by side in silence. The stench was so strong that people fainted. Nearby villagers were forced to help, a decision by the U.S. Army to make them see what they had ignored. Many wept. Some refused to look. The Americans began collecting testimony immediately. Translators moved through the ruins, asking the survivors to speak, to remember, to describe. But for most, words were impossible. When a journalist asked a Polish prisoner what he felt, the man answered only, "Nothing. I have forgotten how." When the trials began, the courtroom in Dachau filled with ghosts. 61 members of the Mauthausen staff sat in the dock, dressed in gray prison uniforms, guarded by the same soldiers who had liberated the camp. Among them were doctors, accountants, guards, and engineers. Men who once held the power of life and death, now silent, pale, ordinary. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, logs, torture devices, gas valves, and the meticulous SS paperwork that had recorded every execution. The bureaucratic precision of murder spoke louder than any testimony. One officer after another repeated the same words. Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. They claimed they had only followed commands, that they never enjoyed killing, that they were part of a system too vast to resist. But survivors remembered otherwise. A Spanish prisoner testified, "They laughed while we carried the stones. They played music while we died." The court sentenced nearly all of them to death. 49 were hanged. Others were imprisoned for life. Franz Ziereis, the commandant, had already escaped judgment. Shot while trying to flee, he died cursing his own men. His body was hung on the camp fence as a warning to the rest. Justice, when it came, felt mechanical, swift, cold, incomplete. No verdict could balance what had happened. The post-war years turned Mauthausen into a question mark on the map of Europe. Austria, eager to distance itself from guilt, called itself the first victim of Hitler. The camp became a site of uneasy silence. For years, locals avoided it. Some claimed not to know. Others whispered that foreigners exaggerated. But the survivors would not let the memory fade. In the 1950s, they began to return. Spaniards, Poles, Czechs, Jews. Men who had lost everything except the need to remember. They built small stone plaques near the quarry, each engraved with the name of a country or a brigade. Together, they formed a mosaic of nations bound by suffering. In 1949, the Austrian government finally declared Mauthausen a national memorial. The barracks were cleaned, the crematorium preserved. But even the act of remembrance was political. For decades, the site emphasized Austrian victims and resistance fighters, while Jewish, Roma, and Soviet suffering was left in the background. It took half a century for all the voices to be heard. The archives told a colder story. Between 1938 and 1945, at least 200,000 people passed through Mauthausen and its satellite camps. More than 100,000 were killed. Some historians believe the real number is higher, perhaps closer to 120,000. They came from over 40 countries. Around 38,000 were Poles, 23,000 Soviets, 10,000 Spaniards, 8,000 Yugoslavs, 6,000 French, and thousands of Jews deported from every corner of Europe. The camp's economic purpose was just as monstrous. The SS-owned company DEST used prisoner labor to mine granite for Hitler's dream projects, monuments for a future Reich that would last 1,000 years. The stones of Mauthausen were meant to build temples of victory. Instead, they became tombstones. In the 1960s, as survivors began to age, they organized associations to collect memories, documents, and photographs. One of them was Francisco Boa, the young Spanish photographer who had secretly saved hundreds of negatives from the SS archives. His images, showing executions, torture, and the officers' private parties, became crucial evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Boyce died in 1951, only 31 years old, but his work ensured that the crimes of Mauthausen could never be denied. In one photograph, the SS officers smile beside a pile of corpses. In another, they drink wine overlooking the quarry. It is the banality of evil, frozen forever on film. Today, those images hang in the Mauthausen Memorial Museum. Visitors walk past them in silence. Some cry, others can't. In one corner, a recording plays, the voice of an old man speaking slowly, his accent thick. They told us to carry stones. We carried them. They told us to die. We died. The miracle is that anyone lived to tell it. Every year, in early May, delegations from across the world gather at the site. The air smells of flowers and rain. Flags wave in the wind. Polish, Spanish, Ukrainian, French, Israeli. Survivors, now in wheelchairs, sit beneath them. Children place wreaths. The ceremony is brief, but the silence that follows feels endless. When the speeches end, some visitors walk down into the quarry. The steps are clean now, the surface smooth, but steep as ever. People try to imagine the weight of a stone, the feeling of cold on bare feet. Halfway up, they stop to breathe, realizing how far it is to the top. The lesson of Mauthausen is not only about cruelty, it's about structure, about how something so monstrous could exist inside a system that looked rational on paper. Every atrocity had a form, a report, a number. Evil wore the mask of administration. Historians call this the banality of efficiency. The camp was not chaos. It was order weaponized. Murder executed by engineers, accountants, and clerks. A world where morality was replaced by procedure. The SS motto was, Meine Ehre heißt Treue. My honor is loyalty. In practice, it meant obedience without thought. Mauthausen became the final experiment in what happens when duty replaces conscience. Even now, more than 80 years later, the echoes remain. Visitors say the quarry feels colder than the air around it, even in summer. Some claim they hear faint sounds at dusk, the clang of metal, the echo of boots. Scientists call it acoustic illusion, but the guides smile and say, the stones remember. There are survivors who still wake at night, hearing the sound of footsteps on granite. One, a man from Krakow, once said during an interview, "Every time I see stairs, I count. I stop at 186. For others, the memory became a calling. Teachers, historians, filmmakers. They dedicated their lives to making sure the world did not forget. Each year, documentaries are made, books published, museums expanded. But no matter how much is said, the core of Mauthausen remains unspeakable, an abyss of logic turned against life itself. The memorial stands now as a vast, open wound in the landscape of Austria. The entrance gate remains, the watchtowers preserved. Inside, the barracks are empty, the bunks stripped bare. The crematorium sits at the far end, silent. The oven doors closed but not locked. A single candle burns beside a plaque. Never again. Outside, granite monuments rise for each nation that lost its people here. The Soviet obelisk stands beside the Star of David, the Spanish triangle beside the French cross. Together they form a language beyond words, a geography of grief. When the sun sets, the light touches the quarry walls, turning them gold for a brief moment before fading into shadow. It's a trick of nature, but those who see it say it feels like forgiveness. In the archives of the memorial, a sentence is written in 20 languages. The memory of Mauthausen is not about the past. It is about the future. Because the lesson is not finished, each generation must look at these stones and decide what to do with them, whether to treat them as relics or as warnings. The story of Mauthausen is not just about Nazis or war. It is about the terrifying capacity of normal people to obey, to adapt, to build hell step by step and call it progress. In 2019, a drone filmed the camp from above. From that height, it looks geometric, almost beautiful. Perfect symmetry, clean lines, order. The irony remains unbearable. Order was what made it possible. Somewhere deep below, the quarry still holds the dust of human bones mixed with granite. The rain has washed the surface clean, but the earth remembers. It always does. When the recording for this story ends and the last sound fades, imagine standing there, at the top of the Stairway of Death, looking down into the hollow where the quarry lies. The wind moves through the grass, the air is cold, and everything is quiet. That silence is not peace, it's witness. The stones do not forgive, but they endure. And maybe that is the truest monument of all. Not marble or metal, not statues or words, but endurance. The proof that memory can survive even after meaning collapses. The stones remain, they wait, and through them the dead still speak.